Is it possible that a simple one-word answer to a very simple question could substantially break open the JFK assassination case after 60 years? A simple one-word answer to a simple question that really doesn't even have anything to do with the events surrounding Dealey Plaza. A simple one-word answer that is easily available from both the FBI and the United States Secret Service. Is it possible? It's more than possible. And what is this question with a simple one-word answer that will shine a deeply penetrating light on the question of conspiracy in the assassination of President John Kennedy? Just this. What was the last name of the FBI informant who provided J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI with information and warning about a four-man hit team traveling to Chicago to assassinate President Kennedy on November 2nd, 1963, 3 weeks before Dallas, as he was making his way from O'Hare Airport to Soldier Field to view the Air Force Army football game? There were actually two tips that reached the Secret Service in the week before JFK's trip here to Chicago, and we'll soon see that the two were interrelated. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover reported the first tip. Hoover's information was that at least one hit team with high-powered rifles would attempt to shoot the president from a warehouse or office building overlooking the president's motorcade route that coming Saturday. An FBI informant named Lee provided the information. And yes, the Lee providing the tip and probably saving JFK's life that weekend may well have been Lee Harvey Oswald. I believe that tipster to the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover was indeed Lee Harvey Oswald. Remember, Oswald had returned from Russia, supposedly a defector, but almost assuredly part of a fake defector program that was run by James Angleton, chief of counterintelligence for the CIA. After Oswald got back to the U.S., he, his wife Marina, and their baby were assigned to New Orleans, where he went to work with Guy Bannister. Bannister was the FBI station chief in Chicago. As part of the task Bannister and Oswald were undertaking, they were supporting not one but two anti-Castro paramilitary groups that were training near Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. But much more importantly, it was at this time that Oswald began infiltrating other anti-Castro groups around the country, especially in the Miami area. What many don't know is Oswald's increasing association with the most violent of the anti-Castro Cuban groups that summer of 1963. The House Select Committee on Assassinations nailed it exactly. The most violent of the anti-Castro Cubans were under the direct control of the CIA from their Miami headquarters. Oswald realized how militant these groups were, and by all accounts, became aware of plots to assassinate Kennedy as payback for the Bay of Pigs. Payback that was being encouraged by Dulles, Angleton, and a faction of the CIA at the highest levels. Lee Oswald was being squeezed on two sides. He was doing his patriotic duty and helping anti-Castro Cuban groups in paramilitary training, but by infiltrating the most violent of these anti-Castro Cubans, he also learned of assassination planning. That's a lot to deal with for a 24-year-old. Oswald was a paid FBI informant, so he did have an outlet for his information, and probably received instruction from the FBI to continue his undercover work to infiltrate legitimate assassination attempts. All this while still supporting anti-Castro groups in their overall mission. And I think that is when he became the tipster to the FBI after he found out about the Chicago plot on November 2nd, 1963. I also think that Oswald was trying to actually save Kennedy's life in Dallas on November 22nd, 3 weeks later. So what was the last name of the informant in Chicago that saved President Kennedy's life? Was it Oswald? Was the Lee who was the tipster, was it Lee Oswald? Well, I've been trying to find out from the FBI. I've filed a Freedom of Information request and asked if I could get any information at all that may shed some light on what the last name of the informant was. I haven't gotten very far, as you might expect, with the FBI so far, but we'll keep trying. Upon Oswald's return to the United States after his fake defection, we know that he was a paid informant by the FBI. We also know that FBI agent James Hosty visited Ruth and Michael Payne's house, where Marina Oswald was staying in the months leading up to the assassination, and where Lee Oswald would visit pretty much every weekend for the 2 months before Kennedy would be killed. We also know that Oswald dropped off a note to FBI headquarters for Agent Hosty shortly before the assassination. And we also know that that note was destroyed just within an hour or so after Jack Ruby killed Lee Oswald in the basement of the Dallas City Jail on the Sunday following the assassination. What was in that note? We know Agent Hosty was instructed not to give any information at all, if possible, about that note or its contents when he appeared in front of congressional committees.
November 24th, it was at least 2 hours after the announced death of Lee Oswald. It could have been 3 or 4 hours afterwards. It was sometime that afternoon of November 24th. Mr. Howe told me that Mr. Shanklin wanted to see me and Mr. Howe in his office.
What transpired it then?
Mr. Shanklin reached down into the lower right-hand drawer of his desk. He reached down and took out the memorandum and the note in question, and he handed it to me, and he said, in effect, Oswald's dead now, there can be no trial. Here, get rid of this. I then proceeded to tear it up. In his presence, he said, no, get it out of here. I don't even want it in this office. Get rid of it. I then took it out and destroyed it.
And how did you destroy it?
I took it into the washroom and flushed it down the drain.
Did you testify before the Warren Commission?
I did.
Did you volunteer or give any information about the note or its destruction?
I did not.
Why not?
I wasn't asked.
Did you give any information or volunteer any information with respect to your instructions regarding Commission Exhibit 103?
No, sir.
Why not?
I wasn't asked.
And did you think about volunteering the information?
No, sir.
Why not?
I was instructed when I went up there that I was to only answer the questions that were set to me, and I was not to expand on anything and not to elaborate, to only answer the questions that were put to me.
And who gave you those instructions?
Given to me by at least 2 officials in Dallas and at least 1 in FBI headquarters. They were given to me by Mr. Shanklin, Mr. Gimberling, who was a supervisor who succeeded Mr. Howe, and also by former Assistant Director Alan Belmont.
But I think first, before we do anything else, it's really necessary to go back and take just a couple of minutes and look at who Lee Oswald really was. On July 9th, 1957, he reported to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California. And it was at El Toro that the CIA recruited top candidates for their clandestine operations. These young Marines were perfect. They were young, dedicated patriots who were already cleared for top security operations. The Warren Commission states that when Oswald was in the Marines, he taught himself Russian. That assertion is ridiculous. How many 17 and 18-year-old new Marines who are busy trying to achieve a confidential classification in radar and aircraft surveillance have time to teach themselves a language as difficult as Russian? Lee Oswald was identified as very bright and sent just up the California coast to the Monterey Language School, where he was taught Russian and became indoctrinated by the CIA for missions abroad. Most members of the Warren Commission, and especially former CIA Director Allen Dulles, knew these facts about Oswald, but chose to denigrate his name, reputation, and innocence by fabricating a fictitious lone nut theory surrounding him. 2. Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union was planned and executed by James Angleton, Chief of Counterintelligence for the Central Intelligence Agency. Angleton was the undisputed champion of clandestine intelligence operations, and just one of the operations he ran was a fake spy program. Oswald had been groomed for just this operation. He was instructed to lay groundwork for his interest in the Soviet system, and was working on radar systems at Atsugi Air Base in Japan that tracked the top-secret U-2 spy aircraft. Angleton and his CIA hoped they could dangle the prospect of radar secrets to the Soviets as an enticement to accept Oswald as a real defector. Every indication is that the Soviets never bought the story. On September 11, 1959, he received a hardship discharge from active service, claiming his mother needed care. Oswald spent only 2 days with his mother in Fort Worth, then embarked by ship on September 20th from New Orleans to France, and immediately traveled to the United Kingdom. Arriving in Southampton, England on October 9th, he told officials he had $700 and planned to stay for 1 week, but on that very same day, he flew to Helsinki, Finland. There were no commercial flights on October 9th to Helsinki. Oswald had to have traveled via military or CIA transport. He was issued a Soviet visa on October 14th. 3. Oswald could never have been welcomed back into the U.S. with open arms if he was a real defector. In March 1961, Oswald met Marina Prusakova, a 19-year-old pharmacology student. They married 6 weeks later. Her uncle worked for Soviet domestic intelligence, and questions later would be raised about whether Marina herself was an agent. Oswald and Marina applied at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow for documents that enabled her to immigrate to the U.S. just 1 week later. 1 week. The U.S. Embassy gave Oswald a repatriation loan of $435.71, and Oswald, Marina, and their infant daughter left for the United States. Does it make any sense that Oswald would be allowed back into the U.S. almost immediately and given a loan if he was a real defector? The CIA will report they never bothered to interview Oswald. Of course that is a lie, and for decades nearly every fact that the CIA will report about Oswald, including in Mexico City and the weekend of the assassination, will be a lie. Why the Central Intelligence Agency to this day withholds critical documents about their relationship with Oswald speaks volumes. If he was truly a lone nut shooter, the CIA would have revealed everything they possessed about Oswald immediately after Dealey Plaza. Oswald was also given a job at Jaeger, Charles & Stover, a photographic firm that contracted to make highly classified maps for the U.S. Army. A job he could never have gotten without the confidential clearance he earned, and a job at the Riley Coffee Company, a CIA front company in New Orleans. Does this sound like a true defector to Russia? 4. Oswald was given a new assignment and new handlers, George de Mohrenschildt and Ruth and Michael Payne. De Mohrenschildt befriended Oswald and provided him money and other resources while he was handling him, including taking Oswald to anti-Castro meetings in Dallas. De Mohrenschildt was making sure Oswald went where the CIA wanted him to go and did what they wanted him to be doing. De Mohrenschildt handed off Oswald to Ruth and Michael Paine, who would handle Oswald from the summer of 1963 until Kennedy's assassination a few months later in November. It was Ruth who would invite Marina and her children to live with her in Dallas. Ruth that would get Oswald the job at the Texas School Book Depository. Ruth that will find the letter supposedly linking Oswald to the General Walker incident. Ruth that will miraculously find another trove of materials to link Oswald to Mexico when there was real doubt about him even being there. And her estranged husband Michael, who takes Lee Oswald to no less than 6 political meetings in October and November 1963 rather than spend time with his children. It will also be in Ruth and Michael Paine's garage, weeks after the assassination, that an Imperial reflex camera will miraculously show up in a duffel bag owned by Lee that had already been searched. The FBI will first try to hide Michael Paine's Minox spy camera and then admit he owned it. So it all begins to make perfect sense now, doesn't it? Lee Oswald is a fake defector to Russia, and then when he gets back, repatriated to the United States, he's sent to the intelligence area of New Orleans, where he works with Guy Bannister. He's also given a job at 2 places he could never have gotten employment at if he was a real defector. The first being Yeager, Childs, and Stovall, which is a firm that makes highly sensitive maps for the U.S. Army, and then also the Riley Coffee Company, which is a well-known front for the CIA in New Orleans. From there, he infiltrates Cuban paramilitary anti-Castro groups and becomes so intimate with the plans that he realizes there are attempts at JFK's life. One big one is going to happen in Chicago on November 2nd, 1963, and he becomes a tipster for the FBI. He was already working and being paid as an informant for the FBI, and he probably saves Kennedy's life in Chicago that Saturday morning. Let's go on and look at what happened in Chicago now the rest of the weekend. A break in the case came on Thursday, October 31st. 2 days before the president's arrival at O'Hare. A landlady at a rooming house here in the vicinity of Clark and Division Streets reported that she oversaw 4 rifles with scopes and a map of the president's motorcade route in one of the rooms she had rented to 4 dark-complected men. Chicago's Secret Service initiated 24-hour surveillance, but an agent named J. Lloyd Stocks blew his cover in an alley behind the rooming house the following evening on Friday and had to take 2 of the men into immediate custody. Stocks questioned one of the suspects all night, while fellow Secret Service agent Robert Motto separately questioned the other man. By morning, neither agent had gotten his man to reveal anything, and Kennedy's plane was due at O'Hare in just a couple of hours. The second tip involved a man reported spouting anti-Kennedy rhetoric and known to have owned multiple firearms. There were some amazing similarities between this man and the man who would be arrested for JFK's murder 3 weeks later.
The planned patsy in Chicago was to be played by a man with a similar profile as Lee Harvey Oswald. His name was Thomas Valet. The Secret Service was tailing him also, since the word was out that he had made violent threats against Kennedy. Consider the parallels between Oswald and Valet. Like Oswald, Valet was a former Marine who was stationed at a U-2 base in Japan. Like Oswald, the cover unit for Valet's probable CIA recruitment was something called Joint Technical Advisory Group. Valet had spoken bitterly of JFK and Cuba. He said, "We lost a lot of good men at the Bay of Pigs." Valet had both rifles and ammunition in his apartment, since he had trained anti-Castro Cubans in Long Island, so the police trailed him. They pulled him over just a couple of hours before Kennedy was to arrive at O'Hare. It turned out that, like Oswald in Dallas, Valet had a job in a warehouse along the president's motorcade route.
Today, condominiums, 625 West Jackson Street, was a warehouse in 1963. Thomas Valet had been given a job at the IPP Lithoplate Company, a printer on the 3rd floor. Kennedy's limousine was scheduled to make a slow turn from the Northwest Expressway onto the Jackson Street exit and go right by Vallee's third-floor window. So in August 1963, just as Lee Oswald was preparing to move from New Orleans back to Dallas, Thomas Vallee moved from New York City back to Chicago. Just as Oswald got a job right over Kennedy's future motorcade route in Dallas, so too did Vallee get a job in a warehouse right over Kennedy's future motorcade route in Chicago.
So the setup with a disaffected Marine patsy in a warehouse on an elevated floor above a presidential motorcade traveling at a slow pace below, with snipers hidden about the scene with telescopic rifles, and the patsy having gun and ammo in his possession, this is all almost eerily similar to what's going to happen in Dallas.
But it gets even more interesting. Just about the exact time JFK is scheduled to visit Chicago, half a world away in Vietnam, South Vietnamese President Diem and his brother are murdered in a CIA-sponsored plot. False CIA cables sent from Washington seemingly give Kennedy's okay for the assassination, even though he has ordered the CIA multiple times not to proceed in their request to kill Diem. Here is famed CIA agent E. Howard Hunt later testifying before a congressional committee about the false cables.
Just that I might be able to improve upon the record.
And what did you understand him to mean when he said to improve upon the record?
To fabricate cables that could substitute for the missing chronological cables.
Did you in fact fabricate cables for the purpose of indicating the relationship of the Kennedy administration and the assassination of Diem?
I did.
And did you show these fabricated cables to Mr. Colson?
I did.
We'll discuss Vietnam more a bit later, but it's important to know that President Kennedy had recently signed National Security Action Memo 263, calling for the almost immediate withdrawal of 1,000 advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1963, and the withdrawal of all American military personnel by the end of 1965. He was so angry after hearing about the murder of the Diem brothers that he recalled Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge that Saturday morning with the intent of firing him upon his return from his Texas trip. He had also ordered his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara to speed up preparations for the withdrawal of American military advisors from Vietnam. Similar to Laos the year before, Kennedy had made the decision that the United States would not get bogged down in an unwinnable war in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And once again, the military and industrial hierarchies that JFK had inherited from the Eisenhower administration were advising just the opposite. President Kennedy's National Security Action Memo 263, ordering all military personnel home from Vietnam by the end of 1965, was reversed by Lyndon Johnson with input from members of the military-industrial complex just 4 days after the murder of JFK in the streets of Dallas, assuring the Vietnam War. Back in Chicago that Saturday morning, November 2, 1963, crowds had started to line the streets in preparation for President Kennedy's visit. The press plane had taken off from Washington, but at least 2 shooters remained at large, and Kennedy's advisors convinced him to cancel his trip. And finally, the arrest of Thomas Arthur Vallee is made. Vallee's arrest was made by 2 CIA-connected Chicago police officers, that is, officers who either worked nearly exclusively for the CIA or took extensive CIA training away from their normal jobs. Officers Daniel Groth and Peter Sherla had watched Vallee all night, but only arrested him at 9:10 a.m., 2.5 hours before the president was due in Chicago and after the trip was officially canceled. The impression given is that the purpose of the 2 intelligence-connected officers may not have been to restrain Vallee, but instead to shadow him until after the president had been shot. For the success of the assassination plot, the scapegoat had to remain free, so long as Kennedy was still coming to Chicago and could be killed there. If the officer's purpose was, as claimed, to get Vallee off the street and protect the president, Well, then why was Vallee's arrest put off until after government authorities knew President Kennedy was no longer coming to Chicago? On the following Monday and Tuesday, Special Agent in Charge Maurice Martineau collected the Chicago plot information from his Secret Service agents. Unlike their work in other investigations, they were told to prepare no documents of their own. Following Martineau's orders, the Chicago agents dictated oral reports to the office's secretary. They were then ordered to turn in their notebooks. Secret Service Washington Chief James J. Rowley had phoned Martineau from Washington asking that the Chicago office use a special COS, or Central Office Secret File Number, for this case. In the Chicago office, only Martineau wrote and saw the top secret report. He then sent it by special courier to Washington Chief James Rowley. Incredibly, Secret Service agents in Dallas and the Dallas police will never be told about the activities in Chicago. They will not be told that a four-man hit team was sent to Chicago less than 3 weeks before with the intent of shooting the president with high-powered rifles from unguarded office buildings overlooking his motorcade route. Records of the two detained men questioned by Secret Service agents Stocks and Motto all night before the president's scheduled arrival the next morning will disappear. A few days after the Dallas assassination, NBC News in Chicago learned about Vallee's arrest. They found that Vallee's license plate information came back as frozen. Only the FBI could obtain this information. Also, the registration plate on the car Thomas Arthur Vallee was driving at the time of his arrest was classified, restricted to U.S. intelligence agencies, and NBC News got no further. Why did James Rowley, head of the Secret Service in Washington, not make sure everyone in Dallas 3 weeks later was informed about the Chicago plot, and especially about securing the motorcade route? We'll see shortly that just the opposite happened. Not only was the Chicago plot not used as a reason to escalate security around President Kennedy, some Dallas police officers were actually ordered to stand down, not to assist in the protection of the president in their own city, and routine assistance from military personnel from bases in the area to assist in the protection of the president was most uncharacteristically refused. Again by the Secret Service in Washington, and specifically by Secret Service Washington Chief James Rowley. Further, when Chicago Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden tried to contact the Warren Commission several months later with information about the Chicago plot, he was arrested on false charges. Bolden was placed in jail, keeping him from telling what he knew about the Chicago plot to the public and the Warren Commission. Not one word about the Chicago plot appears in the Warren Commission report.
We have the Chicago plot, which is so similar to what happened in Dallas. So, I mean, how could that be covered up by Castro? How could that be covered up by the mafia? How could that be covered up by the KGB? That it was just a coincidence that both those plots were so similar to each other? See, clearly somebody was saying, we got to get rid of this guy, and we have to get rid of him in the fall of 1963. We can't let him run the risk of being reelected. We can't get rid of him during an election campaign. We have to get rid of him now. That clearly seems to be the message of those two plots in November. Somebody's hunting down Kennedy. He's not getting out of 1963 alive.
So was Lee Oswald the tipster to the FBI that saved President Kennedy's life that Saturday, November 2nd, 1963 in Chicago? I think it's almost certain that it was Lee Oswald, at least in my opinion. And if the FBI or Secret Service would ever confirm that, then we would be much, much, much closer to solving the JFK assassination. Thank you for watching.